If you remember back during the time of Lent, I mentioned that the Lenten season was really for those who were preparing for baptism, so that they had time to reflect upon the decision that they were making to be baptized. You can imagine in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century how difficult that choice must have been, because it meant that it really did put you at odds with a whole variety and a whole collection of people. At odds perhaps with the empire, at odds with your neighbors, at odds with your co-workers, and wherever you worked, whoever that might be. And so the decision to be baptized was not ever to be taken lightly or made easily. And so the Lenten season was designed liturgically so that those who were preparing for baptism had the time to really reflect upon what they were doing and the choices that they made. When they finally came to Easter and were baptized, it must have been such a tremendous experience, and for most of us, especially for those who were baptized as infants, that it's not an experience we have any memory of, any conscious memory at least of, and so we often take it for granted. But you can imagine in that time period when adults were being baptized, and if you were baptized as an adult, you know how powerful that experience is. Being plunged into the water and asked 3 times, do you believe? Do you believe in God? Do you believe in Jesus? Do you believe in the Holy Spirit? And each time it was almost as if you were going to die, you can just imagine. And so that whole experience of dying, of giving up the old way of life to embrace the new way of life, was a powerful, powerful experience. The time after Easter then, and here's your big theological word for the day, mystagogia. Imagine, that's a $1,000 theological word for sure. Mystagogia just simply meant the learnings about the mysteries. So that those who were baptized at Easter now had a period of time to Pentecost to figure out what all of that was that had just happened to them at Easter in their baptism. So that it wasn't just an experience or an event, but now they were truly inducted, if you will, or joined to the great mystery of who God was, who Jesus was, and what this life in the Spirit, what the life of discipleship was to be about. And so the first few Sundays after Easter focus on that event of resurrection. What does it mean to not just be resuscitated or come back to life? What does it mean to be transformed and changed by one's encounter with Jesus? Being joined to his life, his death, and his resurrection, it's meant to transform and change who you are. Again, the fundamental values of your life, the fundamental perception of the world around you, that being baptized and joined to Jesus means a change in the way that you think, in the way that you act and behave, the way that you believe in the world around you. And so it was those few Sundays, what does all of that mean? But you see, this isn't just about an individual experience, although it was, but it's now I'm joined to a larger community. That it's not just me and Jesus, but it's who we are as the baptized. That the individuals baptized at Easter had to understand that they were joined to a larger entity than themselves. And that was the community, or as it would be called later on, the church. So what does it mean to belong to community? Well, last Sunday we had a great celebration, right, of Earth Day, and joined with our Jewish brothers and sisters to talk about the way that we are joined to creation, to remind us that we're not independent entities, but rather interdependent realities in the world. Interdependent in terms of how we are connected to the earth itself, how we are connected to God's creatures, how we are connected to one another, how we're connected in the universe. If all of this comes from God, if God is the creator of everything, then we have to be understanding that we are interdependent with each other. That any part of creation that suffers, or any part of creation that is injured, in a sense we are too. And the importance of celebrating Earth Day was to remind us of that fact. So that being joined to Jesus' life, death, and resurrection isn't just about faith. It's about reminding us that in the human community, God has created, that we have to stay connected to one another. Connected to the earth, connected to creatures that God has created, connected to the universe itself. So that was the importance of understanding that in this post-Easter time, that there's that sense of reality that we have to continually be reminded of and continually committed to the care for the earth, the protection of the earth, for the awareness, the heightened awareness of the sacredness, of the dignity of everyone, from our, I'll say it, our cats even, not just our dogs, and any animal that we might have. And to have a sense of the dignity and sacredness of life. So today, the image, and in the next couple of weeks, we're going to begin to focus on Pentecost. So today, this is an image that is an important image of the vine and the branches. Again, in the early life of the Christian community, in the early life of the church, this whole new reality that had happened, this great mystery of what it means to be joined to God in Jesus and joined to one another in community, that it was hard to get to grasp really what the significance of that was. And so in the best way that teachers and educators know that examples are used, well, it's like this. It's not to say literally that Jesus is the vine and we are the branches, but it's to use a metaphor, and that makes lots of people uncomfortable when you begin to talk in metaphors because it doesn't seem like it's real. Well, it is real. Maybe not on the physical level, but it's definitely real on the spiritual level. So you could imagine that for those newly baptized, that it wasn't just about fellowship and hospitality and greeting one another and saying hello to one another. That's the physical or literal level. But it's also a deeply spiritual reality that the life force of Jesus now flows in and through me. And in and through us. So that as God is the vine tender, if you will, and Jesus is the vine, that we are the branches. We are the extensions, and here's the idea, we are the extensions of Jesus in the world. So how does that look? The first reading today from the letter of John gives us two ideas. And the word in the text is abide. And that's probably not a good English translation. But the sense of it is that there's an indwelling of God's life within us. So that abiding means to dwell in the midst of. And that's not a common word that we use. I can just imagine hearing some of the CNN commentators. Well, today we're going to abide in love. Can you just imagine? Yeah, right. I'm sure that they're going to say that, right? But you see, maybe that's a part of the problem. Is that if truly we abide in God and God abides in us, then that's the idea that there can't be any part of us that is contrary to God. That, from the bottom of our toenails to whatever hairs that we might have left on the top of our head and everywhere in between, that this life force of God now dwells in us, fills us, pushes out from our bodies, such that there's an electrical field, in a sense, that should be affecting the world, using the electrical field in a metaphorical way. But there should be some effect that the indwelling of God in our own individual lives, as well as in our church and community life, should be forcing out an electrical field, a charged field, if you will, so that everything that it comes in contact with is also being transformed and changed. That's why that what comes out of us, the fruit that we bear, is very significant for the evidence that not only do that we believe, but that God dwells in us. So if we're going to say God is love, then you see why there can't be any room in our lives for hate. Why there can't be anything that we're committed to in terms of prejudice or discrimination against anybody. Because if we're filled with the force of God's love, then at any point that there's hate or prejudice or any thoughts of discriminating against anyone, that stands contradictory to the indwelling of God in our lives. An example, all right? The house that I had lived in for a long time, I really was so excited about having orange trees, and so I went out and I bought an orange tree and planted in the backyard, and I tended this orange tree, and I really babied it and everything. And finally, after about 3 years, it was just loaded with flowers. And I thought, oh boy, I'm going to get some oranges. And they were navel oranges too. So, my mouth watered every time that I looked at the tree. It was just like I was so excited. Well, of course, not all the flowers are going to, because the wind came up. You know how that works? The wind came up and blew all the flowers off. And one set, and I watched this orange grow. And I just babied this, and I watched this orange grow, and it just like, oh boy, one orange. This is going to be so great to taste an orange off my own tree. Well, as trees are, you can probably hear it coming. There were dead branches on the tree. So I wanted to go out and prune the dead branches off, just like the scripture says, right? So I went out one afternoon with my little handy-dandy snippers, and I'm snipping off the dead, and I pulled the orange, what I thought was the branch with the orange on it, I pulled it off to this side, and I snipped, and the orange fell to the ground. I stood there, and I went, are you kidding me? I have nurtured this orange for months. I have waited 3 years, and I snipped it off. I got the shovel and I pulled that darn orange tree right out of the ground. I was so mad at myself. I took it out on the orange tree. I said, that's it. I'm not ever going to have any heartache again of finding out that I snipped off this orange and let it die. That was it. I was done. Yep. So you see, the image is true. Without being attached to that tree, that orange was going to, it wasn't even ripe. It was just a little tinge of orange on it. It wasn't going to survive, except being attached to the tree. Now you see, if we want to survive, what do we have to be? Attached. Attached to the vine. Because the life energy that flows through the vine flows into us, but if we're not attached, then we're not attached to life. I have to wonder if the people that we see in the world around us, and I don't know about you, but in the last few years, like, we've become a meaner people. Meaner. And we seem to thrive on it. We thrive on being mean to people. I have to wonder, is that because we're not attached anymore to one another? We let, Facebook or social media, or maybe we're just so sick and tired of all the meanness in the world that we just isolate and separate ourselves from each other. So that perhaps the metaphor is speaking to those who are newly baptized. Can you imagine newly baptized, so enthused and so excited about belonging to Jesus, and then to go into the community, or maybe not even going into their home community, maybe on some travels where they are, that they end up in some distant city from where they were born. Now you could imagine going from the Middle East, Palestine, going to northern Germany. And you need to know that the skin color and hair color of someone from Palestine is going to be darker and black. And imagine them ending up in Hanover, Germany, where the skin color is fair and blonde hair. Or let's put it Oslo, Norway. No offense to any of the Norwegians here today. And finding out that they go into a church that they think is Christian, and then because of their skin color and hair color, they're not allowed to sit in the body of the church. Imagine the shock to them. I thought this community was attached. And now I find that because of my skin color, or my hair color, or my language, that I'm not at all welcome. Well, that's not just something imaginary, something real and true. Maybe you've experienced that at some level. Maybe you've been on the giving end of that kind of prejudice. You see, the challenge to the newly baptized is they're going to find themselves in situations and places where people aren't changed or transformed by the resurrection of Jesus yet. So how are they going to deal with that? How are they going to respond to that? Remember, they're the transformed and changed one. Maybe the people that they're going to aren't yet changed and transformed. How do you deal with that? Another story, I think I've told this one time before. Growing up in the late 50s and into the 60s, that we were kind of instilled with a sense that as Americans we had to be totally, absolutely opposed to communism. I can remember during the missile crisis in Cuba, the Cuban Missile Crisis, getting under the desk in school because of the threat of nuclear war. And so it was instilled, and watching all of the day in and day out reports from Vietnam, and just being told that I don't know if the word was ever used, that we had to hate communists and those Chinese, and just had to do that somehow or another. Whether, again, it was ever spoken, we just kind of thought that. And so I was telling Eric, and I didn't quite share this story, but the first time that I went to China, and I wanted to go before any change happened, because I knew it was going to happen eventually in China. And I had to tell you, it was like, wow, these people really think differently over here. They see things differently. Went to the Temple of Heaven outside of Beijing, and the temple sits at the top as the world. And then there was a square, and then there was a circle that was the bottom layer, 3 layers. If anybody's been there, you can just imagine it. And so it struck me that these 3 different layers were different sizes. Round, square, round. So I asked the guide, he said, well, he said, indeed, the top one is the earth. The emperor would go to offer the sacrifice for the crops, planting, harvesting. The square was another layer of civilization, but the circle around the square and all of it was China. I said, what? He said, yeah, we've always believed that China was bigger than the world. We encompassed the world. I stood there and I went, gee, I thought we Americans had that view. Isn't that interesting? And sitting in Tiananmen Square waiting for the tour guide to join again, and sitting there, and after being instilled with all of that hate, watching parents, Chinese parents, play with their children. And I sat there and I went, something's odd about this. And I just kept watching. And what was odd was, they played with their children the same way we did. With love. They were just like us. Parents want the same thing for their children anywhere in the world, right? How could I hate them if they were the same, wanted the same, loved their children the same? It wasn't the Chinese that needed to be changed. It was me. That I had carried prejudice and kind of an eye of suspicion. And now found out that the people as a whole were just like us. If God abides in us, then it does mean that we've got a different way of looking, seeing, viewing the world. We're being taught right now to hate enemies, to hate anybody who's different from us. And notice what that first reading said. If you live in fear, and you don't have any love. If you live in love, there can't be any fear. And so when it comes to the way that we look at people, deal with people, interact with people, the way that we welcome and embrace people, the way that we understand ourselves in relation to other people who are different from us, then it can't be that we expect them to think like us, but rather the invitation to understand the way that they're thinking. So that in the way that we come together as a human community, transformed and changed by God's love, that there won't be any hate or prejudice or fear among us. That's a big challenge, isn't it, today? When we fear migrant caravans coming from the south, so we got to build walls. When we continue to enact laws that take away the rights of people because of their sexual orientation. When we decide that people of a certain culture group, language group, gender group, that we have to restrict their rights in order to protect our rights. If God's love truly is in the midst of us, transforming and changing us, then we should be celebrating the equal rights of everyone and not fearing the fact that we white people just aren't going to be in charge forever. That's what the vision of Easter and what the transformation of resurrection invites us to consider.